She stood behind that front desk every single day, calm, composed, invisible to most. He owned the entire building and had never truly seen anyone until her. Russell Prescott was not the kind of man who chased. He was the kind of man people waited for, worked for, and tried to impress. Ruby Sutton did none of those things, and somehow that one woman, tired, quietly carrying more than anyone knew, became the one thing his money couldn't arrange and his silence couldn't protect him from. If you're new here, subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's get into today's story. The Prescott Grand stood at the corner of 57th and Park Avenue like it had always belonged there. 42 floors of glass and dark stone, the kind of building that made people slow down on the sidewalk just to look up. Inside, everything moved with quiet precision. The lobby was warm despite its scale, lit by amber fixtures that cast long shadows across the marble floors. There were fresh flowers every morning, white peonies, always, arranged by a woman named Clara, who had worked there for 11 years and still treated the task like a ceremony. Ruby Sutton had worked the front desk for 2.5 years, and she knew this hotel the way she knew her own apartment. Every sound, every pattern, every face that passed through those revolving doors. She knew which guests tipped well and which ones pretended not to understand the process. She knew that the elevator closest to the East Wing ran half a second slower than the others. She knew that the general manager, David Park, drank his third coffee of the day at exactly 2:15 and was unreachable for 20 minutes after. What she had learned not to think about was Russell Prescott. He came through the lobby most mornings around 8:40. Never exactly the same time, but close enough that she'd stopped being surprised by the sound of his footsteps on marble. He dressed the way powerful men dressed when they no longer needed to prove anything. Dark suits, no tie, a watch that didn't announce itself. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that was just starting to silver at the temples, in a way that felt unfair to everyone around him. His jaw was sharp. His eyes were the kind of gray-green that changed depending on the light, and he had a way of moving through a room that made people instinctively step aside without understanding why. Ruby did not step aside. She smiled, said good morning, and went back to whatever she was doing. This, she had been told by 2 different coworkers, was unusual. She didn't think it was unusual. She thought it was her job. What Ruby didn't let herself examine too carefully was the fact that she always knew when he had entered the lobby before she saw him. Something in the air shifted. A subtle change in the energy of the room, the way conversations lowered half a register. She noticed it the way you notice a drop in temperature before rain, automatically, without meaning to. This particular Tuesday morning in late October, she was working through a backlog of reservation confirmations when she felt it. That familiar, almost imperceptible shift. She kept her eyes on the screen. His footsteps slowed near the desk, not stopped, slowed. She looked up. Russell Prescott was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not the focused blankness he wore in meetings, not the polite neutrality he offered most staff. Something quieter. Something she didn't have a word for yet. "Good morning, Mr. Prescott," she said, the same as always. He held her gaze for exactly 1 beat longer than necessary. "Morning, Ruby." And then he walked toward the elevators, and she looked back at her screen, and her heart was doing something she absolutely refused to acknowledge. The rest of that Tuesday passed the way most Tuesdays did. Busy enough to keep her hands moving, quiet enough that her mind had too much room to wander. Ruby processed 14 check-ins, handled a billing dispute with a guest from London who was convinced he hadn't ordered room service at midnight, and talked a nervous couple through upgrading their reservation for an anniversary they'd clearly been planning for months. She was good at her job. She knew that. It wasn't modesty or performance. It was simply fact, the way knowing your own shoe size is fact. What she was less good at was pretending that the morning hadn't happened. Not that anything had happened. A man had said good morning and held eye contact for an extra second. That was it. That was the entirety of the event. Ruby had replayed it exactly twice. Once while processing the London billing dispute, which she was not proud of, and once on her lunch break when she was sitting alone in the small break room off the second floor with a turkey sandwich she barely tasted. She told herself it meant nothing. She almost believed it. Russell, for his part, spent the better portion of that Tuesday in back-to-back meetings on the 38th floor, where the conference rooms had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Midtown like a portrait of everything he'd spent 20 years building. He sat at the head of the table and said the right things at the right times, and made 3 decisions before noon that would affect the next fiscal quarter in ways his team wouldn't fully understand for months. He was good at this: the strategy, the long view, the ability to stay 3 steps ahead of a problem before it became one. He was considerably less good at understanding why, twice during those meetings, his mind had drifted back to the lobby. Not to anything specific, just to the way Ruby had looked up from her screen, unhurried, unbothered, like he was a person and not an event. Like his presence didn't require any particular adjustment on her part. He was used to people recalibrating when he walked into a room. He hadn't realized, until recently, how exhausting it was to always be the thing a room reorganized itself around. By 4 o'clock, he had a 20-minute gap between meetings. He told his assistant he needed coffee and took the elevator down to the lobby instead of calling for someone to bring it up. Ruby was at the desk, typing something, a small crease between her brows that meant she was working through a problem. She had dark hair pulled back at the base of her neck, a few strands loose near her face. She was wearing the hotel's standard uniform, navy blazer, white shirt, and somehow made it look like a choice rather than a requirement. He stopped at the desk without a clear reason. "Everything running smooth down here?" She glanced up, composed as always. "Yes, sir. No fires today." "Good," he paused. "You handled the Hargrove billing issue this morning." It wasn't a question. She held his gaze steadily. "I did." "He's been a problem before. You didn't escalate it." "Didn't need to," she said simply. Russell looked at her for a moment. Just a moment. And something moved behind his eyes that he shut down before it could become anything recognizable. He nodded once, pushed off from the desk, and walked back toward the elevator. Ruby watched him go and said nothing. But her hands, resting flat on the keyboard, were very still. Wednesday came with a cold front that pushed down from the north and turned the air sharp and dry. The kind of October weather that made Manhattan feel like it was bracing for something. Ruby took the subway in from her apartment in Astoria, standing the whole ride with her coat buttoned to the collar and her bag pressed against her side, thinking about her mother. The call had come the night before. Nothing critical, just her mother's physical therapist adjusting the schedule again, which meant Ruby needed to rearrange 2 of her own shifts before the end of the week. She'd been doing this kind of quiet reshuffling for months now, moving pieces around without letting anyone see the board. By the time she walked through the staff entrance of the Prescott Grand at 7:30, she had the new schedule mapped out in her head and a dull headache settling in just behind her eyes. She didn't mention any of it. She never did. The morning was routine. A group checkout from a corporate block booking, 2 early arrivals that needed to be held until rooms were ready, a phone call from a florist about the weekly delivery. Ruby moved through all of it with the practiced steadiness that her coworker Diane called Ruby's autopilot and meant as a compliment. Diane was 61, had worked the Prescott Grand longer than anyone except the head of housekeeping, and had an opinion about everything that she delivered with zero apology. Ruby liked her for exactly that reason. Diane was also, inconveniently, very observant. By mid-morning, she had positioned herself at the far end of the desk under the pretense of reorganizing the keycard station and said, without looking up, "He came down yesterday afternoon." Ruby didn't ask who. "I noticed," she said. Diane made a small sound that contained an entire paragraph. Ruby ignored it. What Ruby didn't say was that she had thought about that brief exchange more than she wanted to admit. Not because anything significant had been said, it hadn't, but because of the way Russell had stood at her desk without a clear operational reason. The way he'd brought up the billing situation not to assess her performance, but almost as though he'd simply been paying attention. People in his position didn't pay attention to front desk staff unless something had gone wrong. Nothing had gone wrong, which meant he'd been paying attention anyway. She filed that thought under things she was not going to examine and went back to work. Russell came through the lobby at his usual time, 8:42. Ruby was on the phone. She held up one finger in a brief acknowledgement without breaking her call. A perfectly professional gesture she extended to anyone who approached while she was occupied. Russell stopped for exactly the length of time it took him to register that she was busy, nodded once at no one in particular, and kept walking. He told himself that was fine. It was fine. He was a 38-year-old man who ran a hotel group with properties in 9 cities, and he was not thrown off by a front desk employee being on the phone. That was ridiculous. He pressed the elevator button and kept his expression neutral and did not look back across the lobby. He was almost entirely successful at not looking back. Almost. Ruby didn't see it. She was still on the phone, working through the call with her eyes on the screen. But Diane, reorganizing keycards with suspicious dedication, saw it perfectly. She said nothing. She just smiled at the drawer she was sorting through and let it sit. The incident with Mr. Voss happened on a Friday afternoon, when the lobby was at its busiest, and Ruby was running on 4 hours of sleep and a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Gerald Voss was a repeat guest, a finance executive from Chicago who stayed at the Prescott Grand 4 or 5 times a year and had developed over time the particular brand of entitlement that comes from being treated well in expensive places for too long. He wasn't cruel exactly. He was the kind of man who spoke to service staff the way people speak to appliances, expecting function, indifferent to the person operating it. He approached the desk mid-afternoon with a complaint about his room assignment. He'd requested a high floor, east-facing. He'd been given the 24th floor, west-facing. Ruby pulled up the reservation, confirmed the original request, and explained calmly that the east-facing rooms on the floors he'd specified were occupied through the weekend. She offered him the 27th floor west, which had a better view of the skyline at night and was a larger room at the same rate. Voss looked at her the way people look at a wrong answer. "I don't want a larger room. I want what I asked for. This is exactly the kind of thing that shouldn't happen here." His voice had that particular quality, not quite raised but projected, the kind of tone designed to make the person on the receiving end feel small in a public space. Ruby kept her expression even. "I completely understand the frustration, Mr. Voss. Unfortunately, I can't move another guest to accommodate the change, but I want to make sure you're comfortable. I can offer—" "I'm not interested in alternatives," he said, cutting her off. "I'm interested in competence." The lobby wasn't silent, but it might as well have been. Ruby took a breath. She was about to respond. She had a response ready, professional and firm, when she became aware of someone stopping just to her left. Not a guest. The energy was different. She knew before she looked. Russell had come through the lobby from the direction of the restaurant corridor, and he had stopped. He wasn't rushing over. He wasn't making a scene. He was simply standing close enough that his presence registered, his eyes on Voss, with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely unambiguous. "Gerald." His voice was even, almost conversational. "Everything all right?" Voss turned. The shift in him was immediate and involuntary. The slight straightening, the recalibration. "Russell, yes, just a small issue with my room." "Ruby will take care of it," Russell said. Not a question, not a reassurance to Voss, a statement. His eyes moved briefly to Ruby, steady, certain, and then back. "Why don't you head up? I'll make sure everything's sorted." Voss nodded, gathered himself, and left. The lobby exhaled. Ruby looked at Russell. He was still standing close, closer than he usually stood at the desk, and there was something different in the way he was looking at her now. Not the measured neutrality of a man checking on operations. Something quieter and more direct. "You didn't need to do that," she said. Her voice was steady. "I know," he said. And then, after a pause that lasted just long enough to mean something, "I wanted to." He held her gaze for one full second before walking away. Ruby turned back to her screen. Her reflection looked back at her from the dark monitor, and for just a moment, she didn't recognize the expression on her own face. She didn't sleep well that Friday night. Not because anything had happened. Nothing had happened, technically. But because her mind kept returning to that last sentence, the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth. "I wanted to." 2 words, completely innocuous on the surface. The kind of thing a decent manager might say to a good employee after a difficult guest interaction. Ruby had told herself that at least 4 times before midnight, and was no more convinced by the 4th than she had been by the 1st. She knew the difference between professional courtesy and something else. What unsettled her wasn't that she'd heard something else in his voice. It was that she was almost certain she hadn't imagined it. She spent Saturday at her mother's apartment in Queens, which helped. Carol Sutton was 61, sharp-tongued in the way that only women who'd raised children alone could be, and completely uninterested in allowing her daughter to feel sorry for her. The apartment was small and warm and smelled like the candles her mother burned in the kitchen. And for a few hours, Ruby was just a daughter, helping reorganize the bathroom so the grab bars were actually useful, eating leftover soup at the kitchen table, listening to her mother complain about the physical therapist's parking situation with an energy that was frankly impressive for someone recovering from a fractured hip. Ruby laughed more than she had all week. On the subway home, she felt both better and lonelier, the way a visit home sometimes leaves you. Monday arrived gray and cold, and Russell was in Chicago. Ruby knew this, not because anyone had told her directly, but because his absence had a texture. The lobby moved differently without him. The staff operated at a slightly lower frequency of alertness, and David Park held his afternoon coffee standing up instead of retreating to his office, which only happened when there was no one senior on the floor to perform composure for. Ruby noticed all of this, and then felt mildly irritated at herself for noticing. He came back Thursday. She knew the moment the revolving door turned at 8:38, and the lobby did that thing it did. He looked tired, not visibly, not in any way a stranger would catch. But she had been watching him for 2.5 years, and she knew the particular set of his jaw when he'd been traveling too many time zones in too few days. He stopped at the desk. "Anything urgent this week?" Standard question. Operational. She gave him the brief rundown. A pipe issue on the 19th floor that maintenance had resolved. A noise complaint between 2 long-term guests that she'd mediated without escalation. He listened with his eyes on her face in a way that felt less like processing information and more like something else entirely. When she finished, he said, You handled the 19th floor situation before it hit David's desk. It didn't need to hit David's desk, she said. A small smile crossed his face. Brief, almost involuntary, like it had gotten out before he could decide whether to allow it. Ruby felt it land somewhere in her chest and firmly directed her attention back to her screen. Russell stayed at the desk for 3 seconds longer than the conversation required. Then he straightened, said, "Good," and walked toward the elevator. Ruby watched the number above the elevator doors climb and made a decision, quiet and private, that she was going to stop paying attention to how long he stayed. She kept that decision for approximately 48 hours. The invitation didn't come the way Ruby might have expected, if she had allowed herself to expect anything, which she hadn't. It came on a Tuesday evening, 20 minutes before the end of her shift, in the form of Russell appearing at the desk with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the forearm, which was such a departure from his usual presentation that Diane actually looked up from her computer. He set a folder on the desk, something about a guest experience survey the front desk team had contributed to, and said, without particular ceremony, "There's a wine bar 2 blocks east. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the survey results, if you have time." Ruby looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them pretended this was entirely about the survey. "I have 20 minutes, she said. "That works," he said. The wine bar was narrow and dimly lit, the kind of place that felt like a secret, even though it was technically on a public street. They sat at a small table near the window, and Russell ordered 2 glasses of something Ruby wouldn't have been able to afford on a Tuesday night without thinking about it. And for the first 15 minutes, they actually talked about the survey, guest feedback, front desk response times, a recurring complaint about the check-in process for international guests that Ruby had noticed long before anyone put it in a document. Russell listened in a way that was different from how most people listened. He didn't wait for her to finish so he could respond. He actually listened. Ruby found it disarming in a way she hadn't prepared for. Then there was a pause, natural, unforced, and he said, "How long have you been covering for someone?" She stilled. "What do you mean?" "You work like someone who's carrying something outside of work. You have for a while." It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't even particularly gentle. It was just accurate, delivered quietly, and that was somehow worse than either of the alternatives. Ruby looked down at her glass. She turned it once by the stem. "My mother had a fall earlier this year," she said finally. "She's recovering. It's fine." "Is it?" She looked up. He was watching her with that expression she still didn't have a name for, the one that had been accumulating over weeks of lobby mornings and brief exchanges, and one too many moments that she'd been filing under professional. "It's manageable," she said, which was a different answer, and they both knew it. Russell didn't push. He nodded once and let it sit, and Ruby was both relieved and obscurely disappointed. They finished their wine. Outside, the night had gotten cold, and the street was wet from earlier rain, and when they stepped out, he turned up his collar, and she pulled her coat tighter, and for a moment, they just stood there on the sidewalk, 2 people who had not yet decided what the other one was. "Same time next week?" he said. Casual. Almost. Ruby looked at him for a long moment. "That depends," she said. "On what?" She almost smiled. "On whether next week is actually about the survey." Russell held her gaze and said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved, just barely. And Ruby walked toward the subway with her heart doing something she had officially run out of excuses to ignore. You just watched part 1 of this story, and if that last look made you feel something, you're not ready for what comes next. Drop a number in the comments, 1 to 10. Tell me how deep you're already in. Part 2 is waiting. The only question is whether you are.